Every time she closed her eyes, the nightmare began. Not monsters, not shadows, but the warm, suffocating pool that followed her everywhere. The stink, the shame, and the whispers were her daily reality. It didn't matter if she was at home, in school, or at a family gathering. As soon as her body gave in to sleep, even for a moment, the same thing happened. Her parents called it the problem, but to her, it felt like a curse. A silent, invisible curse that ruined everything it touched. She was only 19, but she felt much older, weighed down by something she didn't understand and couldn't control. Her name was Lucy, but most people in the neighborhood had stopped calling her by it. The girl who smells, they whispered instead. They thought she didn't hear, but she did. She always did. The words sank into her chest like stones, each one heavier than the last. At school, Lucy sat alone, even during lunch breaks. No one wanted to share a seat with her. The few brave enough to sit nearby would pinch their noses or make excuses to leave as soon as they could. Some would cover their mouths and laugh when she walked past. Others weren't so subtle, yelling cruel things like, "Go and wash yourself," or "Why do you smell like a toilet?" Lucy never answered. She kept her head down, her fists clenched, and her heart racing. She wished she could disappear, or at least make them understand that she didn't want this either. But how could she explain something that didn't make sense, even to her? She had no control over it. No warnings, no time to prepare. Just sleep, and then the shameful wetness. Her parents tried everything. First, they thought it was just a phase, something she would outgrow like a pair of old shoes. But the phase never ended. They took her to doctors who ran tests and handed them pamphlets. It might be stress, one said. Give it time. Another suggested cutting out certain foods, but nothing worked. Then they turned to traditional remedies. Her mother boiled bitter herbs and made her drink them, promising it would stop the bad spirit causing the problem. Her father took her to an elder who recited prayers and rubbed oil on her forehead. But even that didn't help. Night after night, the sheets were wet. Morning after morning, the shame returned. At home, her parents tried to hide their frustration, but Lucy saw it in their tired eyes. Her mother scrubbed the bed sheets every day, scrubbing until her hands were red and raw. Her father spoke less and less, his voice quiet but sharp whenever he asked. Again, Lucy. Again. She hated disappointing them. She hated the smell that clung to her no matter how often she bathed. And most of all, she hated herself. Public places were even worse. Once during a church service, she fell asleep on a wooden bench. The service was long, and Lucy tried to stay awake, but her eyelids grew heavier and heavier. She didn't even realize she had dozed off until the whispers began. Someone tapped her shoulder, and when she sat up, she felt it, the dampness spreading across her dress and onto the bench. The woman beside her gasped and moved away, holding her wrapper tightly as if Lucy's shame might spread like a disease. The smell reached others quickly. The whispers turned to murmurs, and the murmurs turned to stares. Lucy's mother grabbed her hand and pulled her outside before anyone could say anything. They walked home in silence, but Lucy knew what her mother was thinking. She had embarrassed them both. Again. Moments like that followed her everywhere. At school exams, she would shift uncomfortably in her seat, desperate to stay awake, knowing what would happen if she didn't. At her cousin's birthday party, she stayed far from the other children, afraid she might fall asleep during the games and ruin everything. No matter where she went, the fear of sleeping and the consequences kept her on edge. Her room became her hiding place. She spent hours sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the ceiling and wishing things were different. She imagined what it would be like to have friends, to laugh and play without worrying about what they thought of her. She dreamed of being normal, of waking up dry and clean like everyone else. But those were just dreams. The reality was a bucket by her bed, a plastic cover under her sheets, and the constant smell of something she couldn't wash away. Her parents still loved her. She could see it in the small ways they tried to help. Her mother would braid her hair at night and tell her stories to calm her down. Her father would sit beside her sometimes, silent but present. But love couldn't fix what was broken. Love couldn't stop the wetness or the whispers or the feeling that she was alone in the world. And so Lucy lived each day the same way, holding her breath, holding back tears, and holding on to the faintest hope that one day things might change. Until then, she would carry the weight of the curse, one sleepless night at a time. It wasn't always like this. Lucy's parents could still remember the early days, back when she was just a chubby toddler with wide, curious eyes and a laugh that filled the house. She was their pride and joy, their firstborn. Her mother often said Lucy had brought sunshine into their lives. But the sunshine began to dim when they noticed something strange. At first, they thought it was normal. All children wet the bed sometimes, didn't they? "She'll outgrow it," her mother said to her father one evening as she carried yet another load of damp sheets to the backyard. "It's just a phase." Her father nodded, though his brow furrowed slightly. He didn't say much, but she knew he was worried too. Months passed, and Lucy didn't stop. She was still so young, and they tried to be patient. But as she grew, the problem stayed, clinging to her like a shadow they couldn't shake off. By the time Lucy turned 5, her parents began to realize this wasn't something she would grow out of. The frustration crept in slowly. They didn't mean to be angry with her. She was their child after all. But it was hard. Hard to wash piles of soiled clothes every day. Hard to see the neighbors' children playing freely while Lucy sat apart, her head low. Hard to answer the questions that family members began to ask. "Why does Lucy still wet herself? Have you tried anything?" their aunt had whispered one Sunday after church. Her mother forced a smile and changed the topic, but the words stayed with her long after they got home. The whispers began spreading through the community. In their small Nigerian village, nothing stayed a secret for long. People had their own theories. Some said it was a spiritual attack, perhaps the work of jealous relatives or hidden enemies. Others suggested that Lucy's parents must have wronged someone, and this was their punishment. Lucy's mother, desperate to protect her daughter, sought help wherever she could. They visited the village herbalist first. He mixed roots and leaves into a bitter paste, instructing Lucy to drink it 3 times a day. "It will cleanse her spirit," he said, his voice heavy with certainty. Lucy's mother held on to those words like a lifeline. But weeks passed, and nothing changed. Next, they went to a traveling healer who claimed to have cured hundreds of children with similar problems. He chanted over Lucy, sprinkling her with water that smelled of ashes and rain. Her father paid him with the little money they had saved. "This will work," he told himself. But again, nothing happened. The visits to the hospital came next. Doctors poked and prodded, asking questions that Lucy's parents didn't always understand. They tried medications, diets, and routines, but the wet nights continued. One doctor suggested it might be stress. "Stress?" her father repeated, his voice rising. "She's just a child. What stress could she possibly have?" The doctor shrugged and handed them a pamphlet, its glossy pages filled with smiling families and unhelpful advice. The false hope was the hardest part. Each time they tried something new, they allowed themselves to believe, just for a moment, that this might be the answer, that Lucy might finally have a normal life. And each time, they were disappointed. As the years went on, the strain began to show. Her mother grew quieter, her laughter less frequent. Her father spent more time outside, fixing things that didn't need fixing, avoiding the house. And Lucy noticed. She noticed the way they looked at her when they thought she wasn't watching. Not with anger, never anger, but with something worse. sadness, pity. She hated being the source of their pain. She hated the problem that clung to her like an unwanted guest. She hated the way the other children avoided her at school, the way their parents pulled them close when she walked by. And most of all, she hated herself. But her parents didn't give up, even when hope felt like a distant memory. Her mother prayed every night, her whispered words filling the small room they shared. Her father still carried her to bed when she fell asleep in strange places, careful not to wake her, even though he knew what would happen by morning. Through it all, Lucy's parents clung to the belief that there had to be an answer. There had to be a reason, and if they searched long enough, they would find it. But for now, all they had were questions. Why did this happen to their daughter? Why couldn't they fix it? And how long could they hold on before the weight of it all became too much? Lucy didn't know how much more she could take. Every day felt heavier than the last. She tried her best to pretend it didn't bother her, but the truth was, the shame sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't get rid of. She thought she had gotten used to the stares, the whispers, and the way people moved away from her. But some things hurt more than others. It was the day of her friend Chidinma's birthday party that pushed her over the edge. Chidinma had been one of the few people who still talked to her. They weren't close, not like best friends, but Chidinma always smiled at her in school. She even shared her snacks once, and for Lucy, that small kindness meant everything. So when Chidinma invited her to the party, Lucy's heart swelled with hope. Maybe things were finally changing. Lucy spent the whole week looking forward to the party. She imagined how it would feel to laugh with the other kids, to play without worrying about the smell that seemed to follow her everywhere. Her mother had bought her a new dress, a bright yellow one that made her feel like sunshine. For the first time in a long time, Lucy felt almost normal. But when she arrived at the party, her excitement quickly faded. She could see it in the way the other children looked at her, their noses wrinkling, their eyes darting to the side. The whispers started almost immediately. She tried to ignore them, focusing on the music and the balloons, but the words found her anyway. She smells. Why is she even here? I bet she'll wet herself before the cake is cut. Lucy's heart sank. She wanted to leave, but Chidinma's mother had already seen her and called her over to join the games. She forced a smile and did her best to act like she didn't hear anything. But the tension in her chest grew tighter with every passing minute. And then it happened. She didn't mean to fall asleep. It was just for a moment. The games were tiring, and the sun was hot, and before she knew it, she had dozed off in the corner of the room. When she woke up, the wetness was there, soaking through her new dress and onto the cushion beneath her. The smell hit her immediately, and so did the stares. Chidinma's mother rushed over, her face a mix of pity and frustration. She tried to help Lucy clean up, but the damage was done. The children laughed, louder this time, pointing at her like she was some kind of joke. Chidinma didn't say a word, just stared at the ground, avoiding Lucy's eyes. That hurt, most of all. Lucy ran home that day, the laughter ringing in her ears long after she had locked herself in her room. She didn't cry. She felt too empty for that. But inside, something shifted. She couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. For the first time, Lucy decided to face her problem head-on. She didn't know where to start, but she knew she couldn't do it alone. The next day, she went to her teacher, Mrs. Okafor. She wasn't sure why she chose her. Maybe it was because Mrs. Okafor always spoke to her with kindness, even when others didn't. She told her everything, her voice shaking with every word. To Lucy's surprise, Mrs. Okafor didn't look at her with pity. She didn't make excuses or say things like, "It's just a phase." Instead, she listened carefully and told Lucy she was brave for speaking up. "This isn't your fault," she said, her voice steady. "But we're going to figure this out together." With Mrs. Okafor's help, Lucy convinced her parents to try something new. They found a doctor in the city who specialized in children with similar problems. The journey to the hospital was long and filled with nervous silence. Lucy's hands trembled as they waited in the doctor's office. What if this didn't work either? What if she was just broken? The doctor was kind, but the questions he asked made Lucy's stomach churn. He talked about things she didn't fully understand: trauma, stress, and emotions that could hide deep in the body. It was strange to think that her feelings might be part of the problem, but she listened carefully. The tests that followed weren't easy. Some were uncomfortable, others exhausting. But Lucy pushed through them, her determination stronger than her fear. The doctor also suggested therapy, a word that sounded foreign to Lucy's ears. He explained that it might help her understand herself better, to face whatever was causing her pain. Lucy wasn't sure she believed it would work, but she was willing to try. Back at home, things weren't perfect, but they were different. Lucy felt a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't much, just a small light in the darkness, but it was enough to keep her going. She didn't know if things would ever be completely normal, but for the first time, she believed they could get better. Lucy didn't believe it at first. When she woke up one morning and the sheets were dry, she thought it was a mistake. She sat perfectly still, afraid to move, as if shifting even slightly would bring the wetness back. But as the seconds ticked by, she realized it wasn't a dream. The bed was dry. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of disbelief and cautious hope. She touched the sheets again to be sure, then her pajamas, then the bed, still dry. Her lips trembled and tears filled her eyes. She hadn't cried in so long, but now the tears came rushing, a mix of relief and overwhelming joy. It was just one night, but to Lucy, it felt like she had climbed a mountain. Her mother noticed her silence when she came in to wake her. "Lucy, what's wrong?" she asked, concern etched into her face. Lucy didn't answer right away. She just pointed to the bed. Her mother's eyes widened, and for a moment, she didn't speak. Then she pulled Lucy into a tight hug, her voice trembling as she whispered, "You did it, my child. You did it." That day, Lucy felt something she hadn't felt in years. Pride. It wasn't the kind of pride that came from winning a prize or getting good grades. It was quieter, softer, like a small flame lighting up her chest. For so long, she had felt broken, like she didn't belong. But now, for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that things could get better. The progress wasn't instant. There were still nights when she woke up to find the familiar wetness, and those mornings were hard. But the dry nights began to outnumber the wet ones, little by little. Each dry night felt like a small victory, a step closer to the life she had always wanted. Her parents noticed the change in her. Lucy began to smile more, not the forced smiles she used to give to hide her pain, but real ones. She laughed at her father's jokes again, even the ones she used to roll her eyes at. She helped her mother in the kitchen, singing softly under her breath as they worked. Her parents exchanged glances, their relief almost as overwhelming as Lucy's. At school, things didn't change right away. The other kids still kept their distance, their whispers just as sharp as before. But Lucy held her head higher now. She no longer let their words crush her the way they used to. She started raising her hand in class again, answering questions without worrying about what people thought. Slowly, the whispers faded, replaced by curious glances and hesitant smiles. One day, during lunch, a girl named Amara sat beside her. Amara didn't say much at first, just unpacked her food and started eating. Lucy's heart raced as she waited for the girl to leave, but she didn't. Instead, Amara turned to her and said, "Your handwriting is really neat. Can you help me with my assignment after school?" Lucy blinked in surprise, then nodded quickly. "Sure," she said, her voice soft but steady. That small moment felt like another step forward, a sign that maybe, just maybe, she could have the friendship she had always dreamed of. The changes didn't stop there. The community, which had once treated Lucy and her family with suspicion and pity, began to see her differently. They noticed her confidence, the way she carried herself with quiet strength. Some still whispered, but others started greeting her warmly, asking her how school was going, or offering her fruit from their stalls. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. As Lucy grew older, she found herself reflecting on her journey. The problem that had once consumed her life no longer defined her. It had taken years of therapy, medical care, and unwavering support from her parents to get here. But what mattered most was the lesson she had learned along the way. She was more than her struggles. Lucy decided to share her story. It wasn't easy, opening up about something so personal, but she wanted others to know they weren't alone. She spoke at a small event in her village, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with every word. She told them about the pain, the shame, and the nights she thought she would never make it through. But she also told them about the hope, the small victories, and the strength she had found within herself. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Then, slowly, one person began to clap, followed by another and another. Lucy felt her chest swell, not with pride, but with something deeper: peace. She had faced her darkest moments and come out stronger. Now when Lucy looked in the mirror, she no longer saw a broken girl. She saw someone who had fought, someone who had survived, someone who had won. And that, more than anything, was what truly mattered.